Welcome back. I'm doing one more recording for both my ethics class online and my philosophy class online, and I'm going to build on what we did previously and give you a third extra credit. We talked about empiricism and rationalism, two branches of epistemology, of knowledge. How do we know what we know? I want to look first at the rationalist branch. And of course its roots are in Plato, who said with our mind we know what's in the cave. But we're going to look at Rene Descartes, who is the major philosopher who founded rationalism. And Descartes began with a project, what can we what can we really know? And he began his project with the idea of radical doubt. Let me doubt everything I've ever learned. Let me even doubt that the world out there really exists. Maybe it's simply like a brain in a vat, that somebody's feeding mirages or feeding dreams to me. I'm going to doubt everything. And Descartes thought about it and said, finally, there's one thing I cannot doubt. I cannot doubt that I am thinking. I think, therefore I am. I'm a thinking being, and he came up with perhaps his most famous line, cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. He was a thinking being. He still hadn't proved we have a body, and in fact Descartes was a dualist. He said that the body and the mind are two very separate things, separate substances. How do they interact? But he began with the idea that we could think. And then he continued to build, and the second step in his project was to realize he had in his mind this idea of a perfect being, of a God. Now, where did that come from? It couldn't come into his mind out of nowhere. It must have come from such a perfect being. Thinking about it meant that it existed. For those who have studied philosophy of religion, it's very, very similar to the ontological proof that begins with thinking about God and therefore going from that God actually exists. So the second stage for Descartes was to prove that God exists. And then there's a third stage. If God exists, God is not a trickster. God is not out to fool me. So it must be that the things I see in the world are about me. The world and my body must also exist. So Descartes went from mind to God to body. Now Descartes never dealt with ethics. It was going to take somebody a little bit later on, Immanuel Kant, who's going to give a rational basis of ethics. He's going to say that ethics are based on certain a priori ideas. A priori means in our mind, before we even look out in the world. And we have certain ethical ideas that are in our mind, certain duties that we have, and he called those deontology, deontological ethics, based on the notion of duty. We have certain duties, and the fundamental duty that Kant would talk about, and we'll get more into him in a moment, was act in a way that you would like it to be a universal law. Act in a way that you would like everybody to act that way. Kant called that the categorical imperative. He said that we know that through reason. It's in our mind before we even begin looking out at the world. So, in that sense, Kant was a rationalist. Now, as opposed to the rationalists, we also have empiricists. Empiricists believe that knowledge comes only after we look out into the world. Empiricists use the term a posteriori knowledge, knowledge that comes only after the fact. Our minds are like a blank slate. In fact, John Locke, who was the leading empiricist who got this whole way of thinking started, most empiricists lived in England or in Great Britain, and Locke was part of that British empiricist system. He said that our mind is like a blank slate, a tabula rasa. Information comes in, we take it, and that's how we learn what's really in the world, but there's nothing in our mind until it's first in the senses. And this idea goes all the way back to Aristotle as opposed to Plato, but Locke became one of the leading empiricists, and others were to follow him, and in particular David Hume. And David Hume says we learn everything we need to know from looking out into the world. But David Hume, in a way almost similar to Descartes, was a skeptic. He was full of doubt. He said, how do we know what is right and what's wrong from looking out into the world? We cannot learn an ought from an is. We cannot learn ethics from science. In fact, how do we know that causality exists? We see two events. How do we know that one causes the other? How do we know that God exists? How do we know that anything exists? How do we know that if the sun rose every day for the last umpteen years, it's going to rise tomorrow? And David Hume's skepticism brought him far afield. And when asked, so what's the basis of ethics? David Hume was simply to say, it's feelings. I don't like something because it feels wrong to me. Murder is wrong, it feels wrong. Now, there was a group that will try to learn ethics from empiricism, from looking out into the world, and we're going to call them utilitarians. Utilitarians, it was founded by Jeremy Bentham and then John Stuart Mill. They said that we could learn through science right and wrong. We look out into the world and we say, what actions maximize pleasure and minimize pain? Whatever maximizes pleasure and minimizes pain for human beings and for animals, that is what's right. Whatever maximizes pain, that's what's wrong. And so they did attempt to learn ethics from science, to learn ethics from a kind of empiricism. Utilitarianism is a consequential philosophy because we decide what's right and wrong based on results, based on what causes the most pleasure in the end. Now that's different from Kant's ethics, deontology, which says that ethics is based on duty. We don't care about results. What is your duty? Finally, I want to get to Kant's ideas about knowledge. And it's a little complicated. He was brilliant. And he came up with what he himself called a Copernican revolution about knowledge. Copernican revolution, Copernicus was the one that said the earth goes around the sun does not go around the earth. Until Kant, everybody believed that we could have a God's eye view of the world, that we could know what the world's like, how God would see it. Kant came along and said, no, we could only know how each of us as individuals sees the world. Our mind organizes the world. Our mind approaches the world with certain a priori ways of seeing it. My favorite example, it's not one that I made up, is imagine that your entire life you wore red glasses and you never took them off. And let's say you go out and look at the world, you know for a fact, before you even look at it, that you're going to see the world as red. Your mind organized it. And it doesn't matter what the world really looks like. You can't know what the world really looks like. We know how our mind organizes it. When our mind sees things in the world, it organizes it a priori so that things happen in space and time. If we see something fall, our mind says there must be a cause. There has to be causation. Remember, Hume said we can't know about causation. Our mind has a priori ideas that organize how we see the world. And I happen to think that Kant is absolutely right. In fact, later on, Albert Einstein, in his theory of relativity, would say that how we view things depends on the observer, the person who's doing the looking, and one person can see things differently than another person. I think Kant's ideas led to modern physics. So anyway, we have a priori knowledge and a posteriori knowledge, knowledge that comes through our mind, that comes through our senses. We have Immanuel Kant that says our mind has certain a priori ways of organizing the knowledge that comes to it, and it's through our mind that we figure out what's really happening in the world.